Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Odin's movie blog. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well. And today we'll be talking about something that has been making the waves on social media and in the YouTube world, and that is, was there ever a JJ cut? And should the JJ cut be released? Hashtag release the JJ cut. Now, I say all of this with the big question, the overarching question being, does it really matter? Does it really matter? Would it really make any difference in the current state of Star Wars as we currently have it? My honest opinion is no. If we actually got a cut, if there is a cut, a JJ cut or a George Lucas cut, you've heard about so many different cuts of the movie. If those actually exist, which the more and more time goes by, seems likely that there's at least one or two of these cuts that exist, seeing that there were seemingly a lot of shots and a lot of scenes that were not actually put into the final product. I do believe that because we do have some images and we do have some inside sources, obviously through Reddit, so take it with a grain of salt, that have been saying that there were other films or the film was not what it was now when they had previously worked on it. So I honestly think that there likely is another cut of the film out there somewhere, but I don't think that releasing it or getting access to it would have any difference in it. If we had gotten a J.J. Abrams cut, even if it was to cut out things like the Reylo kiss at the very end, which is what many people say was not in the original J.J. cut, that was something apparently that was pushed on by the studio, and I believe that. And the reason why I'm more apt to believe that there are at least one or two other cuts is because there's just a pattern that Hollywood studios have. They constantly meddle in projects. We can see this in many examples. Fan Four Stick is a great example. You had the director for that film literally going ape crap because, I know that's right, I said ape crap, literally going bonkers because of how much the studio impacted his film to the point of it being one of the worst films of that year. We have plenty of other examples, like even going back. Again, this is not something that's a new phenomenon either. Go back to, the 1970s, 1980s, when you had films like Blade Runner, where that film had such massive studio interference that we got this one version of the film that had a Harrison Ford voiceover for the entire film that basically force-fed you or, baby-fed you, fed you like a child all the information that was going on, when the film and the beauty of the film is you being able to simply look at it and make things out for yourself without having to be fed all of this information. So studios meddling in projects has been around for a very long time, and so I absolutely believe when anyone, even if it is just a rumor, says that's what happened with Rise of Skywalker, I'm sure it's bound to happen. I'm sure that every Star Wars film in the Disney saga has had some meddling in some way. We have proof of that too with the fact that Kathleen Kennedy has put herself into projects. That's the reason why Solo: A Star Wars Story, that budget for that film was just made so much higher than it originally was because they shot around 70-80% of the movie, fired Lord Miller, hired on someone else, and hired on Ron Howard, and then went ahead and made it entirely or mostly different film. And so this is a pattern of behavior that has existed in Hollywood for a very long time and continues to exist to this day, and Kathleen Kennedy herself has shown that she is willing to meddle in projects when it's not going the way that she wants it. Now, could we say that there are people in the higher-ups of Disney that might have gotten involved with this project? Absolutely, because it is not just Kathleen Kennedy that has the ability to put herself and put her voice into these things, but obviously other giant members. I would assume Bob Iger probably has some ability to make decisions or to at least kind of put pressure on people to make decisions since he's seemingly at the top of the food chain. But it goes back to that question. Would it make a difference? Would, if we had gotten the vision that J.J. Abrams had from the start, would that have made any difference? Well, with The Last Jedi continuing to exist in this Disney canon, in this Disney trilogy, I'm sorry, but I just don't think that it would make any difference whatsoever, because The Last Jedi, just from an objective standpoint, does a lot of things that just make no sense within the entire canon of Star Wars. If you want to look at The Last Jedi in isolation, and if you want to ignore the canon, if you want to ignore all the films that came before, the characters, everything that JJ set up in The Force Awakens, and look at it as an independent film, if you have to, therefore, erase everything else, you might have some point. You might say, oh yeah, it took these chances, it took all of these different things, it subverted expectations. The problem, though, is that you can't do that. You can't just ignore those things. You can't look at it as an isolated movie because, one, it takes place in a new trilogy, and all three films in a trilogy have to work together to make sense of anything. And not only that, it's also taking place in what has now been dubbed the Skywalker Saga, which is a 9-film story arc. And so basically you have it where the first three films that were made back in the 70s and 80s, they all make sense within their world. Then you had George Lucas that said, okay, I want to do a prequel trilogy to talk about the origins of Darth Vader. He did that, and even though those films have a lot of issues, especially when it comes to the dialogue and the writing, the overall story arc still makes sense. It still works within the context of the story, and everything still matches together. You get to this sequel trilogy by Disney, and everything is just so all over the place, to the point where even if JJ had his cut of the film, I don't think it would have made any difference. Would you honestly? Let's just be honest with ourselves. If they decided and came out saying, oh yeah, there is a JJ cut, and we're going to re-release it in theaters for a money grab, because Disney could totally do that. They're not going to, because even though they love money, they also understand that they don't want to actually reveal and admit when there's behind the scenes chaos, and they don't want to confirm Reddit rumors and things like that. So of course they're not going to. But if they did, would that change anyone's review of the film? Would that change anyone's opinion on Disney Star Wars? No. And it really comes down to the fact it's because we have The Last Jedi. Now, people can say all they want about J.J. Abrams, and I think a lot of the critiques of J.J. Abrams are valid. I think that you can look to his history, you can look to the projects he's worked on previously, and it makes a lot of sense that he has usually a lot of trouble ending stories. It also is apparent that he takes on all these franchises and props them up using nostalgia and borrowing ideas from everything else, but then he really can't deliver much else other than that. And so even though I think, and this is where I do agree with some people that are saying hashtag release the Snyder cut, or hashtag release the JJ cut, woo, slip of the tongue there. But hashtag release the Snyder cut, that's for you, Lethal Lighting. I will say that it is interesting that even if that was the case, and part of me wants that to be the case, for them to release it, for the very reason that I think a filmmaker, this is where I agree with them, getting back to my main point. Sorry, I got distracted by Lethal. Getting back to my main point, I do think that a filmmaker should be able to put out the film that they envisioned. I think that any director should be able to say, this is what I have in mind, let us go forward with this vision. I think that directors and writers should be able to have those visions play out. And I really do hate when studios come in and say, we know better than you, and we want to try and appease to all of these different online communities, all these different communities, because we think it's going to make us more money. Well, based on the box office, they are making money, but making more money, I would say, is a bit of a stretch. Again, $824 million, after the first 14 days or so. Again, we're now on the Friday after release, so it's now been out for 2 full weeks, about to enter into its third weekend, and it's still not crossed $1 billion. And a lot of other films that have been in other franchises at this point in time already would have crossed that $1 billion mark. When you look to the fact that the budget for this film, and obviously the very massive marketing budget for this film, are probably very expensive, there's a lot of money that needs to be made here before it breaks even. Now, it's getting pretty close to that. Again, if it gets in that $900 million range, based on lower estimates of how much it actually costs to promote and to produce, it will probably have broken even. But the fact that we're saying, oh yeah, the film in 2 weeks broke even, when you've had other films from bigger franchises, or from franchises that were not nearly as big as Star Wars originally. Again, Endgame being a great example of that. Again, the MCU, if someone had said that the MCU back in 2008 when Iron Man came out would be would lead to an almost $3 billion film, no one would have been taking you seriously. They would have said, no movie could ever make that amount of money. Especially the MCU. The MCU is for comic fans, and comic fans are strong and mighty, but there's really not a whole lot of them. Then, of course, they started to appease to the normie audience. The normie audience grew exponentially, and then we got Endgame. They try to do the same thing with Star Wars, but the problem is that instead of, which was what, look to the early MCU years, again, especially even after Disney took over, they still followed the formula of the early Disney years. They've since now started to move away from that, and they now seem to be going more in the direction of what they did with Star Wars, which means they'll have a little bit of extra time, and also they've already laid the groundwork for about 10 years to be able to try and keep audiences on for as long as they can. So if they start to lose money, it's not going to be anytime soon, because they still have amassed this massive audience. The problem with The Rise of Skywalker, and the problem with the Star Wars trilogy, the Disney trilogy at this point, is that from the get-go they said, yeah, we don't really care about the fans, and we don't really care about their opinions. They made that very clear when they signed on Rian Johnson and let him do basically whatever he wanted to do, and he had a huge FU moments in his Last Jedi film. And so what you did was you basically disenfranchised hardcore fans to the point of them leaving, and now you've made it such a mess, or at least Rian Johnson made it such a mess, that that J.J. Abrams had to come in and do something to try and salvage the trilogy, realizing, wait a minute, his movie went off its own tangent, which is not conducive to an actual trilogy, a coherent story. Now I've got to go back in and try and fix the mistakes, fix the problems, and obviously his hands were tied because people like Kathy Kennedy still like Rian Johnson, though apparently a lot of people in Disney Disney still like him. The fact that he has not been officially fired or officially said that his trilogy is done, I think is very indicative of the fact that they don't really hate him. They must, the rumors of them having a good behind-the-scenes relationship seem to be pretty true. Again, especially when you listen to the words of people like Kathleen Kennedy and others that speak very highly of Rian Johnson. So again, they must like him a lot. But we look to the current state. We look to the fact that this film is not performing the way that it should be. This film should be performing like Endgame. And I know that that's been said by other YouTubers, but it is true. When you think about it, when you put things in context, this is the 9th film in the Skywalker saga. This is the 9th film in a franchise starting back in the 1970s that did gangbusters here in the United States. When you adjust those numbers for inflation, the amount of money that those Star Wars movies made is insane. The prequels, even though the prequels have a lot of issues, they still made an insane amount of money. So the fact that we've gotten to the point where they've had a movie lose money in Solo: A Star Wars Story, # Solo lost money, but now they've also have a film that is not performing nearly to the amount of money that they expected and could potentially come in as being the lowest grossing of their Disney trilogy, which is very uncommon when you think about other films in the Star Wars saga that in their own trilogies, usually the last film performed better than the second to last film, at least when you look at the domestic and international numbers, because remember back in the 1970s and 1980s, there was not a real international marketplace for film. Again, a lot of that was pretty much kept in whatever country they were released in. Nowadays, it's such a global marketplace that it makes a lot of sense that the numbers are going to be that much higher because you have these international box office numbers that you just didn't have access to previously. But with all that being said, we are now at a point in time where this film is underperforming compared to what it should be doing. I think that all of us can at least agree to the point that this film should be doing better. And now you have this whole thing going on with the J.J. Abrams cut. And it just goes to show you just how much chaos is obviously going on behind the scenes. Even if these rumors about a JJ cut and a Lucas cut and all these other cuts turns out not to be fully true, it has to be partially true. For the very fact that we know that there is footage out there, we know that there are screenshots, etc., of scenes, and we know that there were people like Matt Smith that were officially attached to this project on IMDb that we just never saw, that just never came to fruition. So obviously there were ideas that were put onto film that just never was put into the actual cut of the film. And we obviously know that there's a lot of scenes that were cut because that's the state of any film. I'm sure that this film was probably well over 3 hours in length when it first came out, and then they had to whittle it down into a more manageable time period. But anyway, let me know your thoughts about this. Do you think, honestly, that the JJ cut would do anything to change your mind if you have seen the film? It wouldn't change my mind simply because I don't think no matter what it would do, that it would fix the Skywalker saga or that it would fix the terrible the terrible diatribe that Disney has gone off on with this new sequel Disney trilogy. Now, could it be a better film? Could it be a more cohesive? Could it be an objectively better film? Yeah, absolutely, because this film is a giant mess. Rise of Skywalker, if I could say anything about it, is a giant mess. It is a giant plot hole in movie form. But if there is this JJ cut, if there is at least another cut of the film or scenes that might fill in some of the gaps or make it more cohesive and make it more coherent and make it flow better as a film, you could have a better film out there. But even with a better film, I think that many of us would still have our issues because no matter what you do in this movie and no matter what the JJ cut has in it, unless you're going to wipe away the Rian Johnson cut of Last Jedi away from Star Wars canon, there are just too many glaring issues that are never going to be fixed. So anyway, let me know your thoughts about that in the comment section below and anything I talked about in the comment section below. If you like this video, smash the like button, give us a subscribe. It helps a lot. You're all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful day. And as always, God bless.